Go ahead, Sean.
Great. Thanks, Jean, and happy January morning to everybody across the state. It's beautiful here in Madison this morning, and I hope it's just as gorgeous where you are today. So Brooke Newberry is this morning's presenter, the first of the YSS webinars. And Brooke is the early literacy librarian at the Crosse Public Library. And some of you might remember her as a session panelist at last year's statewide Youth Services Symposium in Stevens Point. Brooke also is a member of the Youth Services section of the Wisconsin Library Association, and this webinar is brought to you this morning by the Youth Services section, or YSS. And I just want to remind everybody that YSS is the home for teen and children's librarians in our state who push youth services forward and create exciting opportunities for youth librarians to network together, to lead, and to learn. Please consider joining YSS by becoming a member of our statewide association, the Wisconsin Library Association, and together we are stronger. And I agree, and it is my great pleasure to now turn the session over to our colleague Brooke.
Good morning, everybody. I'm excited you guys decided to join me this morning. I would just take one quick second to say that if you are not a member of YSS, I really encourage it. They are an amazing youth association for the state, and if you have been to WLA, you know how amazing their program track is. So highly encourage you to join youth services. But today we are going to learn and talk all about Storytime. And so this is a very basic Storytime 101, and hopefully by the time we are at the end of the webinar, you will be thinking about your Storytime in a new way, or if you've never done a Storytime, you'll be really excited to start them. And so the title is How to Simplify Storytime and Take Over the World, because I truly think that if you have a good Storytime, you can do just about anything. So we will start with our hello song. I was actually going to sing you guys a hello song, and then my friend Amy told me that she would immediately leave a webinar if the person started singing. So instead, I'm going to share my favorite hello songs. I'm not going to take the time to pull up the videos because you guys can all do that on your own time, so I've included the links. But these are three of the most, I think, amazing hello songs out there right now. And Storytime Katie, she just did a post about toddler story times in general, and her name game that she does every morning is really wonderful. Brary's Hello Friends includes sign language, and then the Good Morning Train is just amazing, because how can you go wrong with a train? If you are looking for songs and rhymes, the King County Library System is an amazing resource to use. They have thousands of Storytime songs and rhymes, and it's nice because they have usually a video with every single one of them as well. And also Brary. I'm sure most of you already know about Brary, but if you don't, you absolutely should, because they are amazing. They are one of the best Storytime resources, I think, in the nation, and they're from Canada, so in the world, I guess. So yeah, so if you need hello songs, these are some really great places to start. So Storytime to me is all about finding your inner 2-year-old. I think that to be successful at Storytime, you have to be really silly, and you can't be worried about looking ridiculous, because if you're worried about it, then the parents are going to be worried about looking silly too. I also think that you should always pick things that you really enjoy doing. If you are singing songs that you hate or reading books that you do not like, I think it's very obvious to the Storytime audience. You can only fake it so much. And when you enjoy your Storytime, I think everyone else starts enjoying it as well. And if you do not enjoy your Storytime, then it's definitely time to figure out why. So the first thing I think you should do when you are starting a new type of Storytime, or you're revisiting how you do your Storytime, is to find your reasoning. So why are you personally doing Storytime? Is it because you love entertaining kids? Is it because you just love being around small children? Or is it just entertainment? Can anyone come off the street and do this? I think we as providers have to decide why we're really doing Storytime and what our goal is in Storytime. If our goal is to increase early literacy awareness, then we should go in with a goal of incorporating more messages about early literacy and go in with a game plan of how we're going to do that. I know Storytime is a great thing. It's one of the most favorite things about my job. But I think youth services librarians do a real disservice to themselves when they think of it as only entertainment, because we have so much opportunity to share this knowledge that we have about early literacy with our Storytime audience. So I highly encourage you guys to really, really stop and think about why you're doing Storytime. So next, after you found your reasoning, you are going to need to find your audience. So what kind of Storytime should you offer to your public? Right now in La Crosse, we offer 4 different Storytimes. We have an infant Storytime, which is 0 to 9 months. We have a baby Storytime, which is 10 to 23 months. Then we have a toddler Storytime, which is 2s, and then a family Storytime, which is kind of an all ages Storytime. And we chose to do that because those are is the audience that is best for us right now. We used to offer a specific preschool Storytime, but then pretty much every 4-year-old in our county started going to 4K, so our audience dwindled rapidly for that. So we decided to start doing a kind of family Storytime or all ages Storytime instead. And if you personally have a high preschool population coming to your Storytime, another way to think about rebranding your Storytime is to call it a school readiness Storytime or a school readiness plan, because we have found that anytime you talk about school readiness with parents, they immediately buy into it because nobody wants their child to start like behind any other child. So anytime they can have anything that'll help them get ready for school, they're totally into it. But it's really easy. It's hard to find your audience sometimes, especially if you are in a smaller community. And the easiest way to do that is simply to just pay attention to what's going on around your community. Are you seeing a lot of pregnant moms or new babies in your library? Then maybe it's time to consider offering an infant Storytime. Or maybe you're noticing that you're losing all of your toddlers and they're all going to 4K now and you just don't have the Storytime anymore for them. And so then it'd be a time to think about starting an all ages Storytime instead. So if you found your audience, now you have to find your community. So how will you get the word out about your Storytimes, especially if you are starting a new type of Storytime? There's all kinds of different ways to do this. Word of mouth, I think, is the easiest one. Simply when you see someone in the library who has a child, especially if the child is really high energy, I always stop them and say, did you know we actually have Storytimes and we love high energy children because we have so much fun in Storytime together? And it's also a really great way to catch new moms because most new moms I have found are desperate for something to do with their child. So that's a great way to publicize your Storytimes and the library in general. Flyers are also a great way. You can put flyers up in your library, around the community. If you have a Facebook page, it's a great way to talk about your Storytimes, especially if you get the parents' permission to put up pictures of your Storytime in action, because it kind of lets everyone know what's actually happening in your Storytime. And then community partners are really, really important to us. We have a great relationship right now with our local parenting place, which is a kind of child care referral system. And they talk about us a lot to their new moms, and we talk about them a lot to our new moms. So it works out really well. If you also have a hospital in your area, that's a great way to kind of meet new families. Currently, we have a small little setup at one of the local hospitals in their waiting room where we just have some of our books that we were going to discard, and we just leave them there. And around that area, we put up flyers about our Storytimes and other special events and just things the library offers in general. And we also have information in their new baby packets that they hand out to all newborns. So with all of this, we have had amazing turnouts for our Storytime. We usually fill up on our registration every single session. So yeah, Now you found your community, so now you are about to start your story time, and you have to figure out the setup that works best for you. So here are some pictures of our storytime space and the way we utilize it. The picture on the left there is our song wall, and these are songs that we use pretty much every time in storytime. We introduce new songs usually at the very beginning of a session, but this is a great way to have the parents interact with you because they have a hard time coming up with a reason for not singing if their words are literally right in front of them. It's also nice because it's easy for us to think that everyone knows the words to Where's Thumbkin, but it's not true. A lot of parents just don't know the song. So this is a great way to help them feel more comfortable, and for parents or caregivers that use English as a second language, this can be so beneficial to them. And then in our bottom picture there, that is our setup for our infant story time. So we just set down a quilt, and these are babies that cannot quite walk yet, and most of them can't even crawl. But for the ones that can, we put up body pillows around the corners there because it's really hard for a 9-month-old to crawl all the way over a body pillow. And this is a great setup for us because it's a very intimate setting, which is great for infant story time because we spend most of our time just talking about reading and literacy and early literacy in general. So it works really, really well. And then in our top right, that is our traditional setup for a baby story time or a toddler story time. And we have these lovely little mats that we set down, and we just thought they were so cute when we bought them, but it turns out that children love to fight with them. So we still use them at the very first session of every 6-week session to show parents kind of the way we want them to sit, because if parents are just coming in a room and you say sit in a half circle, they're not going to do it. But if you kind of have like guidelines for them to go sit in, they will. And you just have to accept that the first time there's always going to be children fighting over the blue mats or hitting each other in the face with them or things like that. I have heard that carpet squares are a better option rather than mats because carpet squares are a little bit heavier for kids to pick up. We have not investigated on that yet, but fingers crossed. So once you find your setup that works, you should find your storytime style. This is one of the hardest things I think to do. There's a lot of different types of styles. You could have kind of a quiet, more relaxed, speak very softly and use lots of pauses, classroom type of voice. Or you could just have total chaos in your storytime room, and you could be super loud and super shouty, and your room could look like this guy down here. And most of us are probably somewhere in the middle. I'm definitely leaning more toward the loud and shouty and chaotic one, but not everyone is that way. And it's really important, I think, to know yourself and know what you like and how you want your story times to look. There are advantages and disadvantages to both different types of styles. If you have a quiet story time, then your kids are probably with you for the majority of it. But are they interacting? Are they having a lot of fun? If you have a loud one, then you probably have lots of interaction and fun. But are the kids really getting the most that they can out of story time? A really wiggly child might struggle in a quiet story time, but a quiet one might feel very nervous in a loud one. So it's really up to you how you want your style to be. When I first started as a librarian, I had seen people do story time in the past, and everyone that I'd watched was very quiet and reserved, and they all had beautiful speaking voices, and children were just like in the palm of their hands, just clinging on their every word. And so when I first started, I tried to imitate that, and it failed miserably because that is not my personality at all. I'm very loud, I'm very shouty, and so trying to quiet things down and take pauses just never really worked for me. But it's important to experiment because you don't know what's going to work for you until you try. And it's also okay for your style to evolve and change over time because I think that's normal. And you can be almost a completely different person from one class to the next, just depending on what your group wants and needs that particular day. So now you found your storytime style, and so now you have to find your storytime weakness. And everyone has weaknesses, and they're hard to find, I think, and admit to in Storytime, but they are important to know. So one of the easiest ways to find your weaknesses in Storytime is to have someone sit in and observe. And it can be a colleague, which is always nice, or it can be your boss if that's not too intimidating for you. But just also keep in mind that you can't be mad at them when they tell you the things that you're doing wrong, because you did ask them to tell you. And ask them to specifically look for things that you can improve on. I think kids are always able to tell when you're doing things that you hate. So don't do it if you don't like it. I personally, my biggest weakness is puppets. I just hate puppets. I like them when other people are using them, but when I use them, I just think they're so stressful, and I always forget to tell the kids that, like, the puppet's going to sleep now, so I just take them off my hand, and it just never works out for me when I try to use puppets. I'm always very jealous when people do use puppets successfully. But I know that it doesn't work for me, so I stopped trying to do it. It doesn't mean that I won't go back to it eventually. I might even try next month. But right now, puppets are not for me, so I'm not doing them. Another way to find your weakness is to pay attention to your Storytime crowd. Do you lose everyone when you read the books that you just really love from your childhood? Then maybe they're not the right fit for Storytime. Does everyone go crazy when you're doing the hokey pokey? Then maybe you should save that one for the very end of Storytime when you are done reading all your books. So you found your weakness now, hopefully, and now you're going to find your strengths, because everyone in this webinar is amazing at Storytime. You are an expert at Storytime, and it's so important that you are confident in yourself. Because you should be confident, because you guys are all amazing. And it's good to know what you're good at. These are the things that parents are going to come up and compliment you on, or you'll see kids getting really excited when you're about to do it. And when you're confident, it really comes through in a story time. So another way to find your strengths is, again, to have someone observe you. But most of us, I think, we know what we're really good at. Like, we all know that we're really good at story time, but we also know where we really shine in story time too. One of the things that I think I'm really great at is making people feel comfortable. I call myself like a parent matchmaker, because when I have a new mom or new caregiver come into the group, I always try to find another caregiver that's similar in personality, so that way she has a buddy, someone that she can kind of relate with during the story time or during the play session at the end. So everyone knows your strength now, I hope. And we will go and find your fun. I think playing is so, so important, especially if you are doing story times for under the age of 2. There's a ridiculous amount of developmental skills attached to play, but it also gives parents and children a time to bond, which is so important. And it's a great opportunity for you to role model what play looks like to small children, because it can be really awkward to play with an infant because they're non-responsive, really, especially when they're under 6 months. And you just kind of feel stupid almost playing with them because you're just talking to this thing that's not even looking at you. But it's great to show them that even though they seem like they're not paying attention to you, everything you say is going and just getting soaked up in their brains, because their brains are little sponges at that age. And to show that play can be extremely simple. It can be something as simple as playing peekaboo, or using a hand puppet or your fingers to make shadows on the wall. There's also, so in my story times, I do unstructured play. So all I do is throw out a bunch of toys that we got and books, and I just let them play for about 30 minutes. I also blow bubbles, which is very, very important. If you do not blow bubbles at the end of your story time, you should all start immediately. And if you guys are interested in the toys that we have purchased at La Crosse, the link at the very top, it will be right there. And there's a link to my blog post that talks about where we purchased all of them. If you have no money at all, you can always make your own toys. At my previous job, my budget line was 0, so we made everything homemade. We simply went to Michael's and bought fabric with our own money and cut it into pieces to make scarves. We use Easter eggs to make our own shaky eggs with hot glue and rice. So it doesn't have to be expensive to play. If you have any sort of money at all, though, I highly, highly recommend that you buy that little shape sorter there on the right. That is by far the children's favorite thing in the entire story time. I've had to buy extra ones now because kids were fighting over them, and they still fight over them, but now we always appoint one parent to be the keeper of the shape sorter, and they will literally hold it and hand out the shapes to the children so they can all take turns, which taking turns is another great time to model how it happens in story time. But there's also structured play, and structured play can be anything from crafts that you're doing at the end of story times, or things with like the parachute, or things that have a plan. Either one, structured or unstructured, is totally fine. It's just whatever your comfort level is and how much time you have to prep. I personally don't have a ton of time, so I usually choose the unstructured version. So I hope I've convinced you all to find your fun now. And I'm going to talk about the parachute really quickly. The parachute, I think, is one of the most fun props to use in story time. If you've not tried the parachute, I highly recommend it. These 3 blogs that I have highlighted have some of the best advice for using the parachute in your story times or for its own program in general. And so we use our parachute for all ages, even infants. And what we do is for infants, we just have the caregivers lay the babies on their back, and then we do the parachute softly above them as we sing very soothing rhymes like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And then we also use it for our babies. And for the babies, it's always interesting because you're usually going to have one child who's really terrified of the parachute. So the first session that I use the parachute in, I always have the parachute on the ground, like in the picture, before story time starts. So that way when the children come into the room, they can see it out and they can touch it and they understand that it's not scary and nothing's going to hurt them. So then once story time starts, I pick the parachute up and throw it back in a bag. And then we do our traditional story time until it's time for the parachute. And I tell parents before we start, just remember that if your child gets a little upset, feel free to step away from the parachute. You can go outside if you need to. If someone gets really upset, we'll just stop the parachute, because to me it's not worth it to have a really upset child just because you wanted to do the parachute that day. So when we do the parachute for under 2s, though, we always start on the ground. So everyone just sits down, and we usually do row, row, row your boat, or the Itsy Bitsy Spider. And that's kind of how we start. And then we do a few other songs, and if everyone's still comfortable at that point, we can stand up. And sometimes we stand up and people start having meltdowns, so we immediately sit back down. And it's totally fine to stay sitting down with the parachute the entire time if that is what your audience wants. Another fun thing to do with the parachute is simply to play peekaboo. Children really, really love that. It's also fun if you have small little animals, like small little monkeys, to do 5 little monkeys jumping on the bed with the parachute. They think that's hilarious. Or you can put something soft on there, like soft little blocks or scarves, and just puff them around, and children just love it. So if you're not using the parachute, I hope we will start after you read all these amazing blog posts too, because they are so helpful. And next we'll talk about scarves really quickly. I've highlighted 3 blog posts again that explain how they use scarves in their story time, and they all explain how they use it really, really well. I remember reading all of these posts multiple times before I got brave enough to use scarves, but it turns out they're one of the easiest props to use in story time. So when we use the scarves in story time, we mainly just use them for songs. Sometimes we will just turn music on at the end of story time, and we'll hand out the scarves, and children can just dance, which is always fun. But you can also use scarves to kind of act out the books. It's nice for children to kind of have a prop to use when they're acting things out. It makes some of them a little bit more comfortable. Anna, the future librarian superhero, on her blog she talks about, there's a book called Tip Tip Dig Dig by Emma Garcia, and it's an amazing book. It's out of print, unfortunately, but you can still buy it on Amazon used. But she talks about how in the book there are all these different construction vehicles, and they're all doing a specific move because they're building a playground. And so for her story time, she had each child grab a scarf, and they would act out each movement of the digger or the roller with their scarf. And I've done that since after reading her book, and it works amazing. Children love it. So highly, highly recommend Scarves. This is, again, you can buy Scarves in bulk. They're pretty cheap. But if you want to go even cheaper, simply head over to your Michaels and buy fabric and just cut it. Oh, and Scarves, the easiest thing to do with them is to play peekaboo. You can really play peekaboo with just about anything, which is nice. So hopefully you will all start using Scarves. So next, you have finally managed to figure out everything you need about story time. You know your style, you know when you're going to do it, you know how you're going to do it. And now it's time to panic. And it's really normal to panic. I get nervous every time I start a new session of story time. Even though at this point I've probably done about 500 story times, there's still that moment of panic before you go into story time, I think, especially if you're trying something new. And the most important part is just to remember to take a deep breath. The worst thing that's going to happen is that you're going to have a bad story time, and that's going to happen eventually, so maybe you can get it out of the way really early. Me personally, I started a library job right out of graduate school. I had never actually done a story time for children. All my story time classes, we always just practiced on each other. So I did my very first story time a couple weeks after starting, and it was the most miserable story time in the world. I almost cried at the end of it because it was so awful. It was toddlers, and there was like 30 of them, and they were all crazy because they had never seen me before, and I had no idea what I was doing. The books I picked were awful. The songs, I forgot the words through about halfway through. So the story time lasted about, I think, 13 or 14 minutes before I was like, and we're done, let's sing our goodbye song. And it was awful. It was truly one of the worst story times ever. But the bar was really low for me after that. I knew that no matter what, because I had another story time about 10 minutes after that, and I knew that there was no way it was going to be as bad as this past one, so what was the worst that could happen? And it turns out that next one was totally fine. So it's okay to panic, and it's okay to have bad story times, and just know that at the end of the day, your parents are always going to come back to story time. So it can't be that bad, and it's probably never going to be as bad as my story time was, so feel good about that. Our next slide is all about finding new things. We are all experts at story times, but we can always learn from others. I have personally found some of my best ideas for story times and tricks online. There are a lot of ways you can continue your story time education, though. You can always take classes if you have a local university around you, child development classes, early literacy classes, classes that are specifically about oral storytelling are always really interesting. And you can also just look online and see what other librarians are doing in the profession. But my favorite way to learn new things is to actually go and visit another library and see a librarian actually do story time. To me, that is one of the most fun ways to learn different story time songs and books. It's always fascinating to see someone else read a book that you've also read in story time, just because it's very rare for two people to do it the exact same way. So these are all excellent ways to grow as a storytime provider and a librarian in general. But it's also important to share what you know. People need to learn, and you guys are all experts, so you have valuable advice to give and wonderful things to share. So I really hope you guys are sharing them, whether it's through a blog that you have or through Twitter or Facebook or anything. It's really, really important, I think, to share because you guys all bring something to the conversation. And next, we have finding your personal learning network. So this kind of goes hand in hand with our last slide. And the online community, I think, has truly just saved my sanity at times. These are the people that I turn to when I'm at a loss for what to do, or I simply need to be reminded that I am doing the right things. All of these are great ways. So Twitter, of course, if you're not on Twitter, it's a pretty fun place to be. There's lots of youth librarians on Twitter, and it's very fun to interact with them. Flannel Friday is a great resource as well. Every Friday they do a link roundup of all the flannel stories that have been produced that week. And they also have a Facebook page, which is very helpful. Tumblr, I'm not really sure about, to be honest. I feel like I'm kind of on social media overload sometimes, so I've not really branched into Tumblr, but if you are using it, I hope you will share how you're using it. And then Storytime Underground is a great resource. I am one of the Joint Chiefs of Storytime Underground, so I'm a huge fan of it. And it is a great way. The motto of Storytime Underground is to kind of just learn from each other and promote each other and train each other. So it is a wonderful way to learn what's happening in the profession, but also to get your questions answered if you have any issues going on. We do an amazing thing called Ask a Ninja, where once a week we have people submit questions that they're about things they're having in Storytime issues. And so this past week our issue was baby story times are really awkward. How do I make it less awkward? Help me, please. And we have 3 amazing people each month who write answers for all these questions. And they gave some really, really amazing answers this time, because baby story time can be really awkward, especially if you are starting a new session and you have all new faces. And then Facebook is obviously, you guys probably are all members of Facebook. Flannel Friday and Storytime Underground both have amazing Facebook communities. One of the funnest things is to ask a question on like Storytime Underground, because you usually get about 40 responses within like 2 hours. People are great resources on there. If you are looking for a specific book, or you're doing a theme and you're stuck on a rhyme or anything, people respond really, really quickly on the Facebook group. So highly recommend that. So now it is time to find your breaking point. So there's lovely Amy Poehler telling us all about her nervous breakdown. And this is what I like to call storytime burnout. So at some point in your career, if you've not hit it yet, you will come to the point where you start to hate storytime. So this little picture there on the right, I feel like when you first start to feel the burnout, you're that middle girl who's standing with her hands on her hips, and you're just like, oh, I'm really tired today, but I can do it. I can make it through story time. And then sometimes you're the girl with her hands on her knees, where after story time you're just exhausted and you're like, oh, this is kind of the worst. And then sometimes you're number 6, and that's when you can't even get up in the morning because you know it's a story time day and you are just already exhausted thinking about story time. And it's the thing to know is that all of these feelings are totally normal. Even though you love doing story time and you love seeing all the little kids, you're going to at some point probably hate preparing for it. And the easiest way to prevent burnouts is simply to give yourself a break. No one should be doing storytime 52 weeks a year. That's just way too much. If you are constantly doing storytime, it's really hard to introduce new things in your storytimes and to really give your best self, I think, to the storytime group. So I highly, highly recommend a break. And the easiest way to do it is to simply do 6 or 8 week sessions or whatever works for your group, and then give yourself a few weeks off. This also lets you take vacation days, which is always a plus. And breaks are scary. I absolutely know that. There's always a concern about how the community will react. No one's ever excited when you announce that you're taking a storytime break, but it's okay because your group is always going to come back to you. They're always going to sign up for the next Storytime session or show up that following week. They're never going to stop coming to Storytime simply because you took a Storytime break. So now it's time to find your failures. So on the Storytime Underground Facebook page, I asked people, what is a Storytime book that everyone loves that you absolutely hate? And if you get nothing else from this webinar, I really hope you guys go visit the link on the top there, because it's the thread of answers and there was probably about 50 answers, and they were all hilarious. So I really hope you guys go visit that. But these are all books that people either said they hate or I personally just can't do in story time. Any Dr. Seuss book. Dr. Seuss is a wonderful writer, but they're really hard to read in story time because they're so convoluted and they're so long. So every Earth Day, when you get calls from the area schools and they want you to come read the Lorax, it can be exhausting because that's a really long book and everyone's already heard it at this point or they watched the movie. So it's always nice to kind of have backups in your pocket while you're waiting for that Earth Day call. Chicka Chicka Boom Boom's another one. It's a great book. I've seen other people do it, but for some reason I can't keep that rhythm the entire book. So on like page 5 or so, I usually forget it. And then I start doing it to like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, or it just gets really, really bad. So I don't do that one anymore. Love You Forever. This was the most polarizing answer on Facebook because I personally loved this book, but I had no idea how creepy people found this book, and I would never ever read it in a story time. But apparently people just have real hatred for this book, which is very surprising to me. But that was probably the most talked about. Llama Llama Red Pajama is another book that I really, really love. But I know that I have to kind of tone myself down when I read it because I've made a child cry before because they thought the mom had just disappeared forever. So sometimes you just have a bad experience with the book, which is totally fine. I also had a similar experience with the monster at the end of the book where Grover's looking for the monster, or trying not to find the monster, I guess, where they were convinced a monster was actually going to show up at the end of the book. So once you have a bad experience with the book, it's kind of hard to pick it back up. So, and the great part is you don't have to. There's no one holding a knife to your throat saying you have to read Caps for Sale to every preschooler that you see. There's not. Caps for Sale is a beautiful book and it's a great story to tell, but you don't need to tell it. There are so many stories out there for you to read to your group. So, our next slide is all about finding your success. So there are going to be books that you find that you just love, and all of these books on the slide are books that I know I can turn to and grab for any age, and they're going to work really, really well. Tip Tip Dig Dig, I talked about that one earlier with Emma Garcia. One of the newest ones on here is The Book with No Pictures by Bj Novak. And funny enough, this was also in the Find Your Failure slide. Someone had also said that they hated this book too. But I really, really love this book. If you've not read it, you absolutely should. There's also a really fun video of Bj Novak reading this to a group of, I think, kindergartners. And it's quite hilarious. Pete the Cat, of course, you know and love, I'm sure. We actually read Pete the Cat to all of the kindergarten classrooms in our area. And they all know the song by heart at this point. So that's always fun. And I just really love interactive books. So Count the Monkeys, Tap the Magic Tree, all of these are just amazing interactive books. Is Everyone Ready for Fun? It's a really great high energy book. One of the best things I was ever told about the book Brown Bear, What Do You See? Is that you can sing it to the tune of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and it works every time. And children are just enthralled by it. So highly, highly recommend that you all start singing Brown Bear, What Do You See? So, on this page, we have Finding Your Resources. So these are all great places to go when you need some help with Storytime or you just want to learn more about Storytime. Storytime Underground, like I said, there's a really great resource page on Storytime Underground. There's also a really great resource page on Mel's desk, and there are just tons of different Storytime blogs that you can check out. Flannel Friday, I talked about a little bit earlier. Read, Sing, Play is by Kendra Jones, and she does amazing things with early literacy. She does some really great story times, but she also does different types of like science-based programming for young children. So that's a really fascinating one. The King County Library System and Jayberry are the ones that provide the videos of them singing the Storytime songs. So highly recommend those as well. You have Storytime Katie, who has this amazing website where she has written out different themes, and she has a page that is purely themes. So if you're looking for like crocodiles, you can click her theme page and then find crocodiles, and then you'll find her story time that she's done about crocodiles, and sometimes she even has multiple for the same theme. So she is just a lifesaver. Abby the Librarian is really fun because she also talks about story time as well as other programming. And she also does about a quarterly roundup of like her favorite storytime books for babies. And she always has really, really great books in there. The Show Me Librarian is another great resource to use. If you have not read The Show Me Librarian, you absolutely should. She's probably the smartest librarian on the face of the earth. And she talks about multiple programming, but her story times are also really amazing. And then finally, there's Library Bonanza, and this is another great resource if you are programming for young children. Library Bonanza actually has this great blog post about early literacy messages, because that is one of the hardest things I think to do in Storytime is sharing early literacy messages or knowing what you're going to say. So she actually took the time to break it into the 5 skills, and then for each skill she has about 5 or 6 early literacy messages that you can share with your parents. So this is an absolute lifesaver if you are trying to incorporate more early literacy messages in your story time, or if you are just stuck and you don't have time to find one yourself. It's a great thing to bookmark, so you can just pull it up right before you walk into story time and then go in and say this amazing fact that she has found for you. So highly recommend all of these blogs. And these are only a short sampling because I read a lot of blogs. Yeah, so we are at the end of the webinar, not story time. This is me. I hope you guys email me if you have any other questions. You can ask for my phone number, and then you can call me and I'll sing you my Storytime song if you really want to hear it. That is my blog, Reading with Red, and that is my Twitter handle, at Bj Newberry. So I guess I will take any questions if you guys have any.
Hi, Brooke.
Hi.
Hi, thank you.
You're welcome.
Let me go back up to the questions. There were a few. Oops. So Jill says, and this was from the beginning of when you were talking about scheduling and whatnot. So Jill says that they offer preschool story time on the one day a week that their 4K is off, and their attendance skyrocketed after they changed that day to accommodate the 4K schedule.
That is so smart, and what a great way to respond to your community's needs, I think. I think that's wonderful. Another option that we've started exploring a little bit is going to the preschools themselves. Because if they can't come to you, then what's to say why can't you go to them, I guess. So that's another option if you are struggling to get attendance at your story time, is to start considering going to them.
Awesome, thank you. And then this is when you were talking about puppets.
Okay.
Becky says, thank you so much for the no puppets validation. I don't like them and feel very uncomfortable using them, so I don't use them either. So thank you for sharing this.
So creepy. I just can't. I tried doing them once with another librarian, and every time she would say, let's put the puppets to sleep, and then take them off her hand, and I forgot. And I just grabbed the puppet off my hand because I wasn't used to it. And a kid started screaming. So ever since then, I feel like I maybe have PTSD with puppets. I just can't do them.
Oh, that's good. That was a good story. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
And then Patty had asked about, says she's new to Storytimes and new to the Storytime event and wanted to change things around. And I think your list of blogs at the end and throughout are what she was looking for. So, because she asked if you could recommend any blogs or idea websites that would help her out. So
absolutely. And one of the best things to know is that when you're starting and you're starting to change things, you're probably going to get some pushback, and that's totally normal and expected. It's okay that you want to change things. Change can be hard for people, but you have to do what is best for your Storytime group. When I first started, I took away all of the chairs that were in our Storytime room because I think it created a big disconnect for parents and their children. So I now make everyone sit on the floor unless they realistically really need a chair. Of course, I will get one then, but and it was really hard for people to make that adjustment. They always wanted that chair, but they got used to it. And I think the story times are much more engaging now because I don't let them sit far away from their child.
Awesome. And then Lydia said you were talking about Tumblr. She said she has a list. This is a list of librarians on Tumblr, and I'm going to share that in the chat, and I'll put that with the links that I send out afterwards. And a couple people had asked about recordings and your slides, and yes, we will share the recording and the slides hopefully later today when I get everything uploaded and posted. So we'll share that with everybody via email. And then on the YSS website, I'm sure they'll share it as well. And then Catherine asks, when do you hold your family story time?
So we have experimented a couple different ways with our family story time because that is still the one that we struggle to have a group come to consistently. And we have found the best way is we offer it once on Wednesday mornings at 10:30, and then we offer it again that same night at 5:30. So that way working parents can come to it as well. But also people who either homeschool their children or they're just at home with their kids can come in the morning. And it also is very hit or miss here in Wisconsin because sometimes it's -8 by 5:30. And so that's the one we struggle with the most, but our solution right now at least is to have it once in the morning and then once again at night.
Okay. And Jill says, we do family story time on Saturdays, and it is great. Our families at work really love the Saturday thing, so they are not rushing to the library after work.
Oh, that's really smart as well.
Any other questions or comments that people would like to share? We still have a few minutes left if you are so inclined. Feel free to submit them on the questions panel. Mary asks, how strict are you with the ages in your various programs?
So I personally am very strict, and it is because of where we are. We do have quite a big storytime population. So we make registration for our story times, everything except family story time. Anyone can go to that one. But the story times that we do, especially for babies and infants, are very much tailored to that age range. So when older siblings come, it can be a huge distraction. We also understand, of course, that parents can't or won't necessarily go and get a babysitter for an hour, so they can come to story time. So we do let older siblings come, but we let them know, the parents know when they're signing up, that this story time is really for your younger child. We'd love if you brought a book or something for your other child to do during story time in case they get bored. And then we usually are like, it's because your child's so smart that this is going to be really boring for them because it's meant for a 1.5-year-old, and he's 3, so he's way too smart for this story time.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And that just answered one of the questions that came in. So, and then Camille asks, we have a local child care provider group that is looking for some training on bringing stories to life with puppets, props, flannels, etc. What would be your go-to source for finding great ideas that don't require lots of prep and money?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know, honestly, I would just give them, I think, a list of blogs, if that's an option, or if you're able to go out and show them how you do a story time even. Because I think what you're asking is another group wants to know how to do story time, kind of?
Yes. Yeah, we have a local child care provider group that is looking for some training.
Perfect. So we actually, here in La Crosse, we do a child care provider training once a month. And it's always about a different topic, but I actually just did one about story time, and I used a very similar slide deck to the one I just shared with you guys. And it's just important to tell them why you are doing story time and empower them to know the reasons why you should do a story time and how beneficial it is to them. So yeah, I would say that you are probably their best resource, and to go out to them and train them on how you do story time.
Good idea. Excuse me. Shweta asks, what do you consider an ideal size for your baby, toddler, and family story times?
Great question. So for my infant story time, the under 9 months, I limit it to 10. So that's 10 babies and 10 caregivers. because after that I think it gets pretty overwhelming with that small of a group or small of children. For my baby story time, which is 10 months to 23 months, I limit it to 15. So 15 children, because again, after you cross that threshold, I think it can get really chaotic in there. For toddler story time, we limit it to 20, but we've also started experimenting with doing no registration for that, just because toddlers are a little bit harder to corral, I think, and make sure they come to every story time. And then for family story time, we don't limit it at all. It's just a free registration. I think probably about 20 kids is the ideal range there, but it can also depend on the group and how everyone's responding that day. Sometimes it's really fun to have a huge group of like 50 people in your story time, but it's also really fun to sometimes only have about 3 children show up, because then you can have a really intimate one.
Awesome, thank you. And Jill wanted to share that she did a workshop for child care providers last spring to demonstrate fun new story props like clothesline stories, folder stories, shape monster, etc., and they loved it. The registration was full almost immediately. We had 50 people come, and they built in time for child care providers to actually make 2 new props to take with them. And she says we were excited to have a chance to pass on the information to teachers in the area. So that's a really great programming idea.
That is wonderful.
And Mary had a comment. We have a 4K class visit us once per week, not a full story time, just a book or 2, and it's a good way to get kids into the library.
That is wonderful. We also have, we offer a preschool tour to all of our local preschools in the area, and they come in and they get a specialized story time, and then they get to explore the room, and it's very fun.
And Mary asks, for registered programs, what do you do if people don't show?
Then they just don't show. We're very lenient about that. We would never like blacklist somebody. I always tell my parents I'm always very impressed with them that they come, especially if they're on time. Just because it's hard for me to get out of the house, but it's literally just me. So we tell them when they sign up, this is a 6-week session. Sometimes people are very honest and they're like, I'm on vacation for 5 of those weeks. So we ask that they give up their spot, and we tell them that that 1 week they can just show up anyways if they want. But we're very, very lenient because things happen, and again, it's Wisconsin, so it's really cold, so sometimes it's just too cold for babies.
Yes. Carol asks, how many staff members do you have in the children's department?
So we are very, very lucky in our children's department. We have 5 full-time children's librarians.
Wow.
So we have a manager, we have a school-age librarian, a teen librarian, an early literacy librarian, me, and then kind of a general librarian who helps out everywhere. So we are very, very lucky.
Okay, thank you. And Lydia, she was the one who mentioned the Tumblr and the Tumblarians.
Oh, yeah.
She's sharing some more information because I actually don't use Tumblr either. She says Tumblr is more of an anonymous way for librarians to share ideas. This means it can be nice for venting if needed, with a smiley face behind it. My favorite part of it is when I can find more visual ideas and the availability of other sources such as libraries from around the world and from bookstores. Also, on the social media vein, make sure to use hashtags so other librarians can find you. There's a hashtag Library Life is one of the most widely used hashtags. So, and I will copy that and put that in the chat so people can use that if they are a Tumblr user. And Jill says, how many days per week do you present Storytime? You personally, do you get burned out presenting more than once per day?
So I personally, when we are in a Storytime session, I do 2 Storytimes on a Tuesday and then 2 on a Wednesday. But in the past, I have been the only one who was doing Storytimes, and so I would do up to 7 a week during a session. So during those weeks, I'd absolutely get burned out. After about 2 weeks of 7 a week, you're about done with children in general. But right now, I have, I think, a really good work balance. The 4 Storytimes that I do, I just love so, so, so much. Marge Lockwaters, our boss, is also very vocal about doing Storytime breaks. She thinks they're important to save your sanity, which I completely agree with. So we are very lucky in that we do usually a 6 or 8 week Storytime session, and then we have about 4 or 5 weeks off. So it's really nice. I really, really hope you all start taking breaks if you are not, because it is exhausting to do story time every week.
Mm-hmm. That's why I was an adult services librarian. Sean was the youth services. So that's the last question that I have seen come in. If anybody has any more, feel free to. We do still have about 5 minutes left if you have any other last-minute questions. Before we do that, Sean wanted to have a she has something to say. There you go, Sean.
Sure. Listening to all of the great discussion and reading the questions just reminds me that, as Brooke was saying throughout her presentation this morning, that we all are experts, and there are so many great ideas within the state and within the membership of YSS and WLA. So I really want to encourage those of you who are excited about sharing new program ideas, new service ideas for the youth and family or communities. I really encourage you to consider proposing a session for the annual WLA conference, which is held every fall. If there were a few of you who connected over an idea about, let's say, providing services for child care providers, connect after this morning's webinar and think about a presentation that you could propose for one of our annual conferences, the WAPL conference or the WLA conference in the fall.
Thank you, Sean.
You're welcome.
And I have 2 more questions that came in, and then I think we'll see how long they take. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up by 11. Jill asks, do you think continuity is important, having the same presenter for every Tuesday story time in the session, for example?
So I go back and forth on this. At my first job, we did not really have continuity. We kind of all interchanged doing different story times, and then here in the Crosse position we are very specific about who does every story time. I do think it helps to have that same presenter every single Tuesday. It's just nice because parents know exactly who that there is going to get, and you kind of develop a rapport with the families. You become almost a fixture in their life because they're seeing you for 6 weeks straight, once a week. And we have found that even when we are on storytime breaks, people will still come in on their storytime days just to say hi.
Nice.
So I am a big fan of, if possible, with your group, if you can always have the same presenter. But also making sure people are trained, because there are times, like if you're sick, obviously you don't want to come in into a story time. So it is nice to have that backup if it's needed. But I am kind of leaning more toward everyone being the same presenter every time.
As you were answering that, it made me think of, we're building relationships. You're building that relationship with that family and those children and whatnot. And so that's, I think, a good reason for doing that as well.
Yeah.
And then Carol asks, if you were to have just one youth services staff member, which story time would you offer?
That's really hard because I love all of them so much. I would probably do, that's really hard. I would probably start combining my infants and babies into one story time, and then doing a toddler story time as well. Okay. And then probably a family story time. So I would be doing 3 a week.
Okay.
Maybe. I don't know. That's so hard. Yeah. And I would provide the all ages one twice a week, so 4 a week.
Okay.
Because 4 a week is really like my sweet spot, I think.
Okay.
But you can combine ages, and you just have to kind of adapt to the group.
Right.
So it is possible.
Okay. Thank you. And that's the last question that came in, and that brings us to 10:59, so I think we'll go ahead and end there. One last reminder, Camille asks how about accessing the presentation after the webinar. And you'll get an email from me later today with a link to the recording and to the slides and everything. So you'll just watch your email later today and you'll get that. Thank you to Brooke for presenting today. I think it was wonderful, and thanks to YSS for coming up with this series. So thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.